This video is sponsored by the supporters at my Patreon page. Check it out, see the reward tiers available, and help keep this whole thing going. You know, speaking as a 90s kid, I do think my life would have been greatly improved by the presence of time travel and lesbians. So folks, something a little different this time. I sat down and had a conversation with Savy Leiser, who has the YouTube channel Savy Writes Books, which is a great channel. You should check it out. And she recently released her book, 90s Kids. And I, having recently released my own book, it seemed nicely serendipitous for us to sit down and talk to each other about our various recently published works. So we're going to talk about what's in the book, her thought process in going into it, her motivations, how she approached the material, and also a little bit at the end as to what the experience was like for her working with a publisher, granted a small publisher, for the first time after having done basically self-publishing up to this point. So if you have an interest in the types of fiction that this is, this sort of romance, nostalgia, sci-fi kind of story, or if you just want to find out more about the writing process and the publishing process, I think you should check this video out, and I hope you enjoy it. Let's get to it. So, Savy, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. This is really exciting.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on your channel. This is really exciting because I've loved your channel for such a long time.
Thanks so much. I love what you do as well. And I feel almost like a certain bit of kindred spirits because like there are things about your channel that like you wouldn't expect those on the same site, like between the business stuff and then the anti MLM stuff and then the actual, reviews of books. I'm looking at that going, she didn't specialize all that much either. Neither do I. Okay.
My channel's so chaotic. I'm always worried. I'm like, it's a book review channel, but it's a business ethics commentary channel, but it's a lot of things. And then now this past month, I'm like, well, actually now it's an LGBT commentary channel for now, and then we'll go back to book reviews. So it's all over the place. I mean,
last month was Pride Month, so
yeah.
That was incredibly fitting.
Yeah, there you go.
So, your new book, 90s Kid.
Right here.
There it is, folks. So first of all, do you want to give sort of the elevator pitch on it?
The short elevator pitch is it's lesbian Back to the Future.
Love it on principle already. Do you want to give a slightly more detailed version
Absolutely,
of
yes. So it's a book about the way that the world has evolved a little bit over the past 30-ish years. It's about two girls. One was born in 1990 and one was born in 1999, so opposite ends of the 90s. And one is a teenager in 2006 when there's MySpace and emo music and that whole world. And one's a teenager in 2015 where she's on Tumblr and trying to avoid everyone trying to get her to get on dating apps because she doesn't like men and things like that. There's two different eras. Both of them go to the DMV to take their driving test, and at the DMV they've been secretly developing a time portal this whole time, so they both get in a time travel accident and get sent back to 1989 where they're both 16 years old, where they meet each other, fall in love, and run from government officials trying to keep them contained at the DMV so they won't cause a time paradox.
That's just that description is a ride, and it's a ride I'm loving.
Thank you. It's a lot of like pop culture references everywhere and stuff like that.
So I don't want to be so crass as to just flat out ask your age, but I am curious as to your own sort of relationship to the 90s and that era.
You can ask my age. I'm 28. So I was born in 92. So I guess I was a child for the entire 90s. But I have a pretty good memory, which is a double-edged sword. I used to have like a photographic memory before I started OCD medication, but that's a completely different story. But I used to have a very photographic memory, which is good because it's like I have so many strong and vivid memories of different time periods, even if I was very young during them or didn't seem to perceive them as an adult or anything. But at the same time, it's like, well, now all my childhood trauma is never going away. It's there. I don't get to forget any of that. Even if I'm like 2 years old, So that's like, this is a double-edged sword. However, I did, I think the pop culture of the night, like the 90s was the worst for me. Like it was a terrible decade for me in my life. I had a terrible time, but the pop culture was awesome. I loved the music. I loved the TV shows and the movies and all of that. Growing up and being a teenager in the early to mid 2000s, I was really into 80s nostalgia, which I feel like is everyone has like nostalgia for like 20 years before the time they're currently in. So that's where I was at that time. I was so into like 80s music and like dressing like I was like an 80s pop star and things like that. I was always like the quirky girl. So that was my teenage years. So I got so invested in 80s pop culture and 90s pop culture growing up that I was like, I got to put all this into a book, especially because then once I went to college, I started getting nostalgic for like the 2003, 2004 era pop culture. And I was like, man, I need to like put on my eyeliner and listen to Green Day and all of that. So I was very excited to just explore the nuances of all of that. And, you know, there were people like people who were much older than me would ask like, is a teenager in 2006 and 2015 going to be that different? And I was like, yes, they are going to be that different. I promise. I will make it clear.
So this might seem like an odd question, but I'll explain in a second. Do you have older siblings?
No.
Okay, that I find that interesting, and here's why. So, like, I was born similar to you, but in the 80s. I was born in 82.
Oh, cool.
And as a result, like my actual memory of the 80s and 80s pop culture especially, it's very narrow and it's very child focused. Like I remember He-Man and Thundercats and the real Ghostbusters cartoon, but I have no nostalgic memories for MTV or what was on the radio or anything like that. And the reason that I asked is like there are a lot of people my age who have stronger 80s nostalgia, but I tend to find that they usually have older siblings who were filtering that down to them. So that at a younger age, they were still experiencing the pop culture of people older than they are. So I couldn't help but wonder if that had been the case for you. And it's interesting that it wasn't.
No, I think it's just that I've always been a nostalgic person and I've always like been like really interested in the past, but not necessarily in like the history of it, but more like the pop culture of the past. So I've always just like sought it out intentionally. Like when I was in high school, I would like make 80s mixtapes where I would find like greatest hits of the 80s CDs and make burn CDs of them and things like that. So I would like look for it on purpose because I always thought it was cool.
That is very good. So there seem to be like three main components to the story that we've got here. There is a lesbian romance, there is time travel, there is 90s nostalgia.
Yes.
I'm kind of curious as to what the chicken and the egg on that was. What was the one where you started from, and at what point did the others get integrated?
Okay, so I think I want to say I think the time travel was where it started from because I first started mapping out this novel after I had a dream that I had time traveled into the 80s, and while in the 80s I met a cute girl and we fell in love, but we had to go back to different time periods afterwards. And then I was like, that could be actually an interesting novel when I woke up. So I started like writing down ideas for that, and then I combined it with this component of I always used to make this really stupid joke. So just like, let this be a lesson to everyone. Your stupid jokes can get incorporated into a novel if you want. I would always make this stupid joke because, you know, in the city, I don't have a car. I've never owned a car. But I did used to have a driver's license, but I don't use it because I don't have a car. So I let my driver's license expire. And then I would go to a bar and they'd be like, you know, your ID is expired. And I'd be like, literally, why do you care? It was always valid. It was never fake. So like, it says that I was over 21. So if I was over 21 when it was valid, how could I be under 21 now? You can't get younger. And then I was like, unless the DMV is developing time travel, and that's why they have to update your license so much because theoretically they're the ones regulating whether or not, you know. So I was like, what if that's it? And people were like, Savvy, this is the stupidest joke of all time. Just like go get your license updated. And I refused. And so now I just take my passport to the bar. And instead I wrote a novel where the DMV actually developed time travel.
I honestly, that was on my list of things to ask was how the DMV got roped into this. And that is a better explanation than I could have possibly
That's
hoped
where
for.
it came from. And my publisher, when she was doing the final edit, she was like, Savvy, you never actually explained why the DMV developed time travel in the first place. So I'll just read the little explanation from this book because she was like, I was like, she's like, why did they develop it in the universe though? So there's a part where she first goes back in time and is asking the DMV official, why did you develop time travel at the DMV? And he stares at it, says that he stared at her and seemed confused as if she just asked him the most obvious question in the world. We're the Department of Motor Vehicles. We handle all forms of travel. Would you rather the IRS handle it instead? That's why time travel's developed at the DMV.
I love it. Like that is one of my favorite kinds of explanations for especially sci-fi nonsense.
Yeah. There's a lot of sci-fi nonsense in this.
I love explanations that are basically one line, borderline dismissive explanations. That basically signals to the reader like, look, there is an explanation, but this is all you need in order to deal with what we're going.
In life, we don't understand everything about everything anyway. The main characters don't have to understand. So, like, there'd be drafts and iterations we'd go through the editing process where it's like, do we want to explain more of the mechanics of the time travel here? And we would. And then we'd be like, oh, but then that raises a million other questions. And then we'd be like, what if we just didn't? Like, time travel happens, you know? I mean, in fiction, it doesn't happen in real life, because it doesn't make sense for it to happen in real life. So yeah, we just kind of left it up to the reader's imagination in a lot of ways.
So like as a Doctor Who fan and as a fan of time travel stories, I would be remiss not to ask this. How did you settle on what your time travel rules were going to be? Because there's a lot of options as far as that goes.
I don't want to give it away, but there's a plot twist.
You don't have to say what they are, because it's not uncommon for the exact nature of the time travel rules to be a spoiler later on.
Yeah.
But I'm just curious as to like how you came to settle on whatever ones you did.
So I've been writing this book for so long that I'm like wondering if I can even, I've been working on this for like 3 years. And so let me see if I can even remember how I settled on what they were. I think I started with making them similar to the rules in Back to the Future and then making them completely different from them as a plot twist. Like that's kind of, but I won't say in what specific ways because I don't want to spoil big plot things. But I started my inspiration with that. And then since one of the main characters in the book is really into sci-fi, she keeps trying to figure out what's going on by applying the rules from Back to the Future and from Star Trek and from fictional sci-fi that she likes, try to apply those rules to see if that can help them figure out what's going on. And in the end, it doesn't, but at least it's a starting point for these two teenagers in this weird situation.
Yeah, now I like that as an approach, because I think there's often a temptation in science fiction that isn't science fantasy. So like you don't get to say with Star Wars, but for aside from that subgenre, I think it's very common for science fiction stories, especially books, because they have the space to do it, to over-explain. Yeah. To the point that I find myself going, no, I got it. You can stop explain. No, I got it. I got enough to get the story. You can stop. But like to a certain extent, I get it, because there is at least a sliver of a sci-fi audience that wants all those details. Mm-hmm. But I personally tend to appreciate a more streamlined approach.
Yeah, because I really wanted this book to focus on the characters' relationship, the characters each having their own arc. You know, one character being very introverted and having to learn to come out of her shell, but still maintaining her introverted personality, but learning to, you know, trust people more. And then the other character who's obsessed with nostalgia for the past because she's living in fear of the future and having to learn to understand that there's an acceptance that time is going to move forward in life. So I wanted to focus it a little more on those arcs than on like the mechanics of the time travel or those things, but I wanted it to make enough sense that readers weren't going to be like, wait, what? So I think I struck that balance. I've gotten a few Goodreads reviews that says I did a good job striking that balance, so I'm feeling confident now. But yeah, that's because I wanted to kind of keep the focus there.
That's always like early in the release of a book's like that's the thing that hangs over your head. Like, I tried to have it do this, and hopefully it did.
Exactly. Yes.
You're stuck with that until more feedback comes in.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Now, I am also curious in terms of what you feel the target audience is for this particular book.
So two target audiences. One would be current teenagers because it's a young adult novel, and the second would be adults who love to read YA. So this book was almost, I mean, it was definitely written for the YA audience, but it was almost even more so written for the adults who love YA audience. Because there's like a whole category of adults who love young adult. I'm one of them. There's a lot of people in their late 20s to mid 30s and even older who are like, when's the next YA novel coming out? When am I going to get this book from John Green or from Rainbow Rowell or whoever? They're just like chomping at the bit for those. I am too. I get it. So I thought that it'd be cool to have a YA novel that represented the time periods of like current mid-tier millennials. I said mid-tier. I meant like mid rate. I didn't mean, I'm not talking about the quality. I'm talking about like the year you were born. But I wanted to have something that would represent that era of like, oh, here's a teenager life when the world was entrenched in the internet, but it was still pre-social media and we barely had MySpace, and like people having a cell phone meant you were a cool kid and things like that, versus like seeing, a time period where teenagers now who are kind of on that millennial and Generation Z cusp, to represent them as well. But then we're also seeing teens on TikTok nowadays being nostalgic for like, oh my God, I wish I could have been growing up when they were listening to Misery Business and stuff like that. And I'm like, why are you nostalgic for, I'm not even 30 yet and you're already nostalgic for my teenager life. So I guess it could really fit for that teen audience as well. So I think those are kind of the main demographics.
Yeah, because that was something I found myself thinking about. Like, well, given the age of the protagonist, I have to assume there's a YA audience as a target.
Yeah.
But then, would they have nostalgia for the '90s? And I wasn't necessarily thinking it wouldn't work, but it made me want to pick your brain on that a little bit.
So yeah, that's the idea. Is that it's a crossover for those like the millennial Gen X adults who still love to read YA and never want to give it up, and also the current teenagers who are nostalgic for the past they didn't get to live, which I was as a teenager as well. So that's kind of the two target audiences of it. Hopefully it resonates with both of those groups.
So it sounded like wanting to tell a queer love story was part of your initial impetus to that. Did you have either influences on how you wanted to do that, or did you have a list of be sure I don't do this?
Oh yeah. So when it came to like the queer element of it, there was the main thing I wanted to show was that like you can have three time periods that are very close together in the grand scheme of the universe, but are so vastly different when it comes to like mainstream acceptance of queer culture. Like you can look at 1989, right? And during that time when they're stuck back there, they're seeing like protests going on regarding like a lack of healthcare for the HIV pandemic, because that was a huge issue at that time. Then they're in 2005 and it's like, well, do we support same-sex marriage? That's kind of a left-wing progressive thing to think, versus like now that's the very baseline for not being an asshole. Like you that's not progressive. That's like the minimum. That's less than the minimum. And now there's like, while we're still have a long way to go with in terms of a lot of things have improved already so much within the past 10-15 years that we're now seeing more of like a mainstream pop culture narrative around this. And that's why we have one character who's really into the like Tumblr fan fiction culture, who's into like writing queer fan fiction online, and her sister's like, are you gay? And she's like, no, I'm not gay, but she's gay. Spoiler, she's gay.
Self-insert, perchance?
Oh, no. See, neither of these are self-inserts, although I will say I definitely relate a lot to both of the main characters. The other thing I wanted to show was just kind of the specifically, and this I guess is done in a more subtle way, but specifically the way that like the bisexual and asexual acceptance has increased a lot over between the 2000s and the 2010s, like there's no question. So we can see that evolving as well, because the one main character, Nicole, is a lesbian, but she's also kind of asexual coded in that she might be somewhere on the asexual spectrum. And Bex is definitively bisexual, but doesn't know it right away, because in 2006, a lot of people were kind of like, well, if you're gay, then that's, I guess you could get married to someone if you have to do that. Like, as opposed to like her being like, well, she is attracted to multiple genders and that is okay. But a lot of people don't understand or accept it. You see kind of the contrast where Nicole's in 2015 and her best friend is actually bisexual, and it's like not even treated as a bad thing or a weird thing at all. That's just kind of a thing she knows about him. And like, so it just kind of shows a progression there, and how those time periods treat it differently, and how it's kind of, I guess this is where like the Star Trek influence comes in, where it's like you want to look at an optimistic view of the future. So the whole main theme throughout it is like the world gets better as things go on. It might not seem like things are okay right now, and there might be a lot of things that are difficult and you have to work on and that society really needs to fix, but overall it's going to continue to improve because history has shown that to be the progress. That and teenagers from every time period are all the same, and the DMV always sucks.
So am I correct in this? Is this the first time you've worked with a publisher as opposed to self-publishing?
Yeah,
on this one?
yeah. I mean, in the past, I worked with like a indie publisher, like more of like a self-publishing service type of thing, where like I retained the rights and paid someone for self-publishing services on a small scale. I've done that before, but this is the first time I've worked with a publisher in the traditional kind of way, where like, yeah, they cover all the costs and I get the royalty payment. Yeah.
So was there, other than just sort of them covering the cost, were there any significant differences of just the process of getting the book ready for publication or actually having it published that you felt were notable versus having done self-published or close to self-published previously?
Yeah, I think that, well, one thing I really liked was getting connected with industry professionals without having to connect myself to people. In the past, like if I wanted to, hire someone for a service, when I'm self-publishing, I'm in the entrepreneurial role there. I have to find everyone, versus like, this cover, I'm in love with this cover. I'm trying to figure out where to get it tattooed on me because I love this cover so much. And this cover was designed by, I did an interview with him on my YouTube channel. His name's Eric Evanson, who was the artist who did the cover, and he was actually an artist for one of the officially licensed Back to the Future comics. So it was really cool.
Really cool.
I was just fangirling like out the ass, dude. I was going crazy about how excited I was to work with him. And his work just turned out so beautiful. And it was like my publisher, she had started a books division after she'd been publishing magazines for 13 years. So she had known him from he had done art for a magazine she worked on and things like that. So she was able to make that connection. And then the layout artist for the book was the same as the layout artist my publisher uses for the magazines that she publishes and things like that. So it was interesting to get connected with people who are going to do a professional job without having to be the one to hire and interview and look at work samples and discuss rates. Instead, someone else handled that end of it for me. But I will say that working with a small press was really nice, because as opposed to having an agent and having a big corporation publisher, I definitely felt like I was included in every single part of the process. I was in every single cover design meeting. I reviewed the layouts, all of that, which I guess is more work for me, but is also more creative input for me. So I thought that it was just a really collaborative process where we kind of got the best of every world in that sense.
That sounds like it went really well for you. That's great.
Yeah, I had a great time. I would definitely work with a small press again, especially because, on my channel on YouTube, I'm always talking about how I'm so passionate about women owning small businesses and things like that. So to have my first traditional publishing experience to be with a woman-owned small press was just kind of perfect. I'm like, this is great. I love it. So I was really happy.
That's fantastic. So I'm going to have links in the description to for people to be able to check out your book. We'll put both the Amazon and the Goodreads links in there so that people can check those out. And hopefully I suspect that there's definitely going to be a chunk of my audience who will probably find something to like in this. So
I hope so. I'm so happy about this book. My joy for this is like through the roof. I've been having such a good time since this came out. So I really appreciate being able to talk about it on your channel and getting to just kind of talk with you one-on-one. It's been really nice.
It has been. So thank you so much for coming on.
Absolutely.
Got to thank Savy once more for taking the time to speak with me. I had a lot of fun doing this. It's a little different than what I normally do, and don't expect this to become a regular feature or anything, but I had a lot of fun with this conversation. I hope you did as well, or that you found it enlightening. Check out her channel. Check out the links related to her book. Maybe buy it if it sounded interesting to you, or check out other people's reviews if you want to get even a little more sense than you might have gotten from this video on it. Also, later next week, and I'll put a link in my community tabs, and I'll pin it in a comment once it's available, there will be a video of Savy interviewing me about my own book over on her channel. So check that out when that goes live. In any case, whatever your thoughts are on anything she and I talked about, drop something down in the comments and let's talk about it. Thank you so much for your support. And if you're just able to drop the usual like, share, subscribe, helps me out greatly. No pressure though. End of the day, you're the council. I'm just running the meetings. So until next time, this council is adjourned.